"Who is the father?" he demanded quietly, staring at the massive pregnant belly of the wife who abandoned him. The suffocating tension in that divorce lawyer's office was thick enough to choke on. Julia looked the deadliest mob boss in Milan dead in the eyes and said, "I didn't know when I left, but when a ruthless rival cartel finds out she's carrying the true Rinaldi heir, Matteo must transform from a controlling monster into the ultimate protector just to keep his new family alive." Let us step into this scene together, you and I, because this cold Milan office is the absolute chaos kicks off. We have this sweaty lawyer practically hyperventilating at a mahogany table, gripping his fancy silver pen like it is going to save him. Spoiler alert, it will not. Over by the glass we have the man himself, Matteo Rinaldi. Look at how the camera just locks on to him. Guys like this do not fidget. They just stand there, letting that dark Mafia ink on their neck do all the thing. The silence in that room is so heavy you could cut it with a knife. He is just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The lesson here is pretty simple, but keeps you alive. Never confuse a predator's dead silence with peace. They are just doing the math on how to take you out. The camera stays glued to Matteo for 11 agonizing minutes, giving us a row front to those heavy letters scarred across his knuckles. They scream a tragic backstory buried under decades of absolute ruthlessness. But here is the wild part. The heavy oak door clicks open, and the big bad mob boss drops his shoulders. Julia steps in looking like an absolute ghost in a heavy camel coat over an ivory dress, and his entire nervous system completely short-circuits. She keeps her face like an ice-cold mask, but do not let that fool you for a second. Her jaw is practically locked out of pure stress. Here is a lesson to remember when dealing with dangerous people. The quietest ones in the room are all ones carrying the most desperate, hardcore survival instincts. Now check out this tight cloak up on her eyes. She flat out refuses to look at the guide, taking her sweet time setting her bag down and smoothing her coat just to hide how bad her hands are shaking. But when she finally steps into the light, the plot twist hits us like a freight train. The boom boom. She is 7 months pregnant. She managed to hide a literal growing baby from a paranoid mafia don for almost a year. Just imagine the pure terror of keeping new life a secret from a guy whose day job is ordering hits. Matteo finally turns, and you can practically hear his massive ego shatter into a million pieces when he spots her stomach. The lesson here is pretty heavy. You truly never understand how violently a relationship can break until you study exactly how the trap was built in the first place. All right, we need to dissolve this scene and jump back 18 months so you and I can see exactly how this nightmare started. We are at this crazy high society masquerade in Florence, surrounded by his insane wealth and totally rotten people. Julia is a nobody here, chilling in a borrowed blue dress, and clutching a glass of champagne just to survive the snobby vibes. She dips into a dark corner to stare at an oil painting, and out of absolutely nowhere, Matteo is standing right behind her. These top-tier villains never make a sound when they stalk their prey. They wait until it is too late to run. So here is your mandatory life lessons for the day. Always trust your gut instincts when the hair on the back of your neck stands up, because someone probably stepped way too close in the dark. Let us be real. A guy standing 6 feet and 3 inches tall, who is built like a brick wall, has no business sneaking up on anybody. He looks like an underground brawler shoved into a custom Italian suit, rocking faded prison tattoos like they are designer brands. He leans in with this super deep rumble, whispering that she is staring at the wrong painting. Julia tries to play it cool and hold her ground. fighting for just a tiny scrap of control by telling him another piece of art has more honest grief, but then you make the absolute worst mistake possible. She turns and looks him straight in the eyes. His gaze is just this freezing, pitch-black void of nothingness. The life lesson here is simple. Never lock eyes with the devil unless you are fully prepared to deal with whatever demons look back. Looking into this dude's eyes is honestly like staring down a freezing well. It is not even aggressive, which somehow makes it 100 times scarier. It is just this empty, bottomless hunger. He drops his name and holds out this massive hand covered in gang ink. Even though every single alarm in her brain is going crazy, she shakes it and gives him her name. He hits her with that slow, creepy smile and whispers that he already knew who she is. That is Stalker 101. He immediately goes full obsession mode, buying out her favorite cafe and filling her apartment with roses to make it look like a movie. Yeah. The life lesson is a brutal reality check. The absolute most dangerous cages in the world are often painted to look exactly like pure, grand romance. Listen up, because you and I are about to break down exactly how this toxic emotional trap snaps shut. Mateo pulls the oldest, most effective trick in the villain playbook. He makes her feel like she is the center of the entire universe. Now, Julia is from Milan, so she knows his family practically owns the criminal underworld. But he is playing the perfect gentleman, asking her all these deep personal questions. Here is the tragic plot twist, though. He is not being romantic. He is literally just collecting data to map out all her weak spots so he can lock her down. Take this life lesson straight to the bank, folks. Hardcore manipulations almost always feels exactly like a beautiful fairy tale right at the beginning. You fall into it slowly, and then suddenly you are completely trapped. Fast forward 8 months, and those golden handcuffs are fully locked. They tie the knot at his super isolated private estate. She is glowing in a white dress, while he is looking like the Grim Reaper in a sharp black suit. The guy even squeezes out one fake tear at the altar to seal the deal. For 4 months, she is stuck in this heavily guarded honeymoon bubble, but then the whole facade rots. Suddenly, it is cancelled dinners, locked study doors she cannot go near, and sketchy muscle arriving at 2 in the morning. She finally realizes she married an actual monster. The life lesson here is a harsh truth. Figuring out you are stuck in a total nightmare is one thing, but finding the courage nations to pack up and run is a completely different game. The night this beautiful lie burns to the ground is a dead, quiet Wednesday. Julia is sitting awake in the dark kitchen. The window is barely cracked, but it is enough to hear Mateo using that bone-chilling voice mobsters use when they are ordering a hit. He tells his guys to handle it and leave zero trace. Instead of packing her bags, her brain just goes into denial mode, pretending he was talking about a boring corporate merger. She lies to herself for 6 agonizing weeks just to get out of bed. But this lesson remains absolute. No matter how hard you try, you can never truly outrun the truth. The entire fake reality completely shatters the second some random, furious woman shows up and starts violently rattling their massive iron front gates. You have got to focus on this venomous new character. She is dripping in loud luxury and demanding to see Mateo, proving she belongs in his messy underworld. The woman looks Julia up and down, checking out her cheap cardigan and massive diamond ring, before dropping a nuclear bomb. She laughs and calls Julia pathetic, a temporary placeholder. It is an absolute critical hit. Julia stumbles back inside, practically gasping for air. But the real kicker happens when Mateo gets home. Julia confronts him, and this absolute menace does not even try to deny it. He just gives her those dead eyes and says it is complicated. Are you kidding me? The life lesson here is loud and clear. When someone hands you a vague, lazy excuse, it is always the absolute loudest confession of pure guilt. He literally brushes over her total devastation and tells her to chill out, but listen up, because the stuff he refuses to say is what finally breaks the spell. He never promises to drop the side chick, and he refuses to even say he loves her. That coldness turns Julia into an absolute ghost. Fast forward to a freezing Sunday, and she finally makes her move. She plans this exit like a top-tier assassin. There is no screaming, no crying, no begging for closure. She knows tears will just keep her trapped. She packs one tiny bag, leaves that heavy diamond rock on the kitchen counter, and swaps a billionaire lifestyle for a blank slip of paper. The lesson is undeniable. Sometimes going totally silent is the most devastating and powerful escape plan you can execute. You and I have to look at her final note. No angry rants, just cold, hard facts. She writes that she cannot be the person he needs for his dark lifestyle, and says goodbye. Just like that, she cuts the toxic cord. But the absolute craziest plot twist of this whole drama is that she walked away totally blind to her own secret. 3 weeks later, a perfectly nice nurse gives her the test results, and Julia completely freezes in horror. Matteo finally found something good, but let his own darkness destroy it, while Julia escaped the Mafia boss, only to realize she is carrying a ticking time bomb of his bloodline. The final life lesson is brutal but real. Sometimes saving your own soul means stepping into complete isolation, and true freedom always comes with a terrifyingly heavy price. Picture this opening shot with me, because this drama is absolutely unhinged. We are watching Julia play four-dimensional chess, while her clueless ex blindly plays with fire. She calculates every shadow, bracing for the fallout. Hiding a pregnancy from a literal mafia boss was not just petty, it was raw motherly instinct for survival. She simply needed this absolute menace to sign those divorce papers so she could breathe. People use kids as pawns in breakups, but Julia knows trapping him just a fresh cage in the same prison. Instead, she escapes to Turin, making art to keep the mafia darkness away. The lesson here is loud and clear. The smartest thing you can ever do is build your own solid foundation before you let anyone else walk across it. Look at this gorgeous, irreversible train wreck unfolding. We find Julia, 5 months pregnant, moving like an absolute chess grandmaster in a room full of total amateurs. She spent half a year quietly building a steel lifeboat, sitting next to a divorce lawyer with ice in his veins. For 6 whole months, her underworld boss husband, Matteo, brushed off the split like a bad joke. Now the camera catches him frozen. The harsh daylight hits his knuckles, turning bone white against that heavy mahogany desk. The boss just realized his iron chains finally snapped. It is a dead, silent flex of power changing hands. Listen, real freedom always requires cutting the invisible ropes tying you to your captor, even if your own hands bleed holding the knife. You guys, you can literally feel the air bleeding right out of the room. Matteo locks his eyes on her in the dim light, tracking her breathing like a wounded wolf deciding where to bite. But Julia is carved from solid rock. She smooths her coat, completely icing him out, and tells the lawyer to start. Matteo does not scream or flip the heavy desk. He uses dead silence as a weapon, suffocating the room just by standing there. Meanwhile, his top muscle, Enzo, is awkwardly shifting around, caught between mafia loyalty and some heavy, crushing guilt. It is a terrifying truth about facing a predator in the wild. Total silence is never just empty space. When the person holding the weapon goes completely quiet, They are just taking aim. Look closely at Enzo lurking in the shadows. He used to be the only soul in this violent crime family who treated Julia like an actual human being. Now, his eyes drop to her baby bump, and you can see the devastating math breaking his brain. Suddenly, the rookie lawyer totally ruins the quiet, barking a foolish demand at the boss about the kid. Matteo lowers his voice to a raspy whisper. In the underworld, a scream means anger, but a whisper means someone is measuring a coffin. This lawyer keeps pushing, totally blind to the explosive tripwire he just triggered. Let this be a grim survival lesson for all of us. When you find yourself standing directly in front of a starving lion, demanding immediate answers will only make you the prey. You have to notice the insane psychological warfare happening in this exact frame. Julia hides the wild hammering of her heart behind a mask of pure ice. She slides her gaze right past her terrifying mob boss husband and coldly drops the bomb that the kid is completely out of his reach. Matteo physically recoils. His heavy voice drops her name like an iron anvil against the wood. When Julia tells her lawyer to move on, this wretched, suffocating gasp escapes the crime boss. It is the agonizing sound of a tyrant, physically choking on his own sudden lack of power. He sinks into his chair, totally collapsing under his own weight. Here is a miserable but necessary truth. Anyone used to ruling your spirit will treat a healthy boundary as high treason. Matteo completely flattens his voice into that dead, chilling frequency. It is the exact horror movie tone you hear right before the violence pops off. He calculates the bitter math out loud, accusing her of hiding his unborn heir the very day she ran away. But Julia refuses to play into his toxic theatrical sadness. She meets his hollow eyes and quietly states she only found out about the baby after she escaped. The air gets so thick you could slice it with a blade. The rookie attorney stares at his shaking pen, while Enzo turns into a literal statue. The fallen king loops the timeline, obsessively, totally unable to accept this epic defeat. Carry this ironclad rule with you. You will lose your mind trying to reason with someone deeply in love with their own lies. Stick with me here, because you and I need to unpack this exact moment together. This is the split second Julia finally shatters her chains. She looks into the eyes of the Mafia boss who used to own her, calmly stating she needed time to decide if he even deserved to know his kid. For a fleeting beat, this iron-willed criminal actually cracks. She stares at the ruthless killer she once bled to save, entirely erasing his massive ego from the narrative. She speaks only of what her baby needs, making his mobster demand completely invisible. It is a profound awakening. True healing never starts when you fix the person who broke you. It begins when you stop trying to save the fire and just pull the innocent out of the flames. The silence stretches as Matteo absolutely chokes down his defeat. He stands up, blocking out the daylight, ordering the lawyers out. When the rookie hesitates, Matteo drops the temperature to absolute frost, telling them to leave right now. Julia gives a slight nod, and her human shields vanish. Only Enzo remains in the shadows. But Julia does not even flinch. She presses her hands against the mahogany desk, staring down the dark reflection of her ex in the window. He whispers to the glass, asking if the blood is truly his. She answers with a rock-solid yes. It is a terrifying climax, carrying an undeniable truth. Sometimes, the only way to beat the monster, eat plant and stare directly into its hollow eyes. The reaction hits like a literal gunshot. Matteo spins around, violently tearing the dead air apart, crossing the floor until his massive shadow swallows her entirely. It is a primitive scare tactic to make her flinch, but the camera shows us his broken posture. He stands like a marble statue, yet his eyes are sunken deep into exhausted, hollow pits. The dark ink climbing up his throat only highlights how sick and pale he looks. Get this. Here is a crime boss who demands to rule the earth, yet losing one single woman is rotting him from the inside out. It is a visually striking lesson on the illusion of power. Absolute control is a total ghost. If you grip the world too hard, your own bones are the very first things that will break under the pressure. For one agonizing second, the ghosts of her old devotion come rushing back. Julia watches the physical decay of the man standing in front of her, and a tragic ripple of pity crosses her face. But the illusion shatters. She knows his grief is not coming from a broken heart. He is just mourning the loss of a prized possession. He whispers about his unborn son, his voice breaking as he swears he would have protected her. A shaking hand reaches out, hanging in the cold air, unable to cross the ruins he built himself. She stares at his hovering fingers, feeling a quiet sorrow. It exposes the most dangerous trap in human nature. Just because a wounded wolf cries in the freezing snow does not mean it will hesitate to tear you apart when the deep hunger comes back. Let's unpack this epic defense move together. She looks right into his eyes and states his suffocating control is the exact reason she buried the truth. Over by the door, Enzo turns to the wall, unable to watch his untouchable boss get dismantled by a pregnant mother. Slowly, Matteo pulls his hand back. He swallows a volcanic surge of poison, using the terrifying discipline of a hardened criminal. In a heartbeat, the wounded lover vanishes, replaced by the cold interrogator. He names Turin as a hiding spot, flexing the dark web of his Mafia network. Julia not even blinks. Listen, real peace is never about finding a place where shadows cannot reach. It is about learning to walk through the dark without letting the monsters break your stride. Julia tries to bring Lick back to the room, discussing her new life likes. This is just some legal dispute. But Matteo destroys that illusion in a single breath. He tells her, without a drop of warmth, that Turin is completely off the table. The lighting feels colder as he drops the hammer, showing zero rage, just the absolute finality of a dictator laying down the law. He will never allow his heir to live outside his territory. Legal papers mean literally nothing to a mafia boss who lives above the law. In his twisted mind, he's just collecting a stolen asset. It is a sickening realization, but a vital lesson. Extreme toxicity never sees you as an equal human being. They only see you as a misplaced object that needs to be dragged right back to the cage. Let's pause the video right here, guys. Look at this absolute menace. Matteo leaning on the desk, refusing to yarn Swordsmates like he's holding a loaded gun. Then he drops a massive psychological nuke, whispering for her to just come home. It is calculated to trigger that toxic trauma bond. But our girl, Julia, sees the trap. She stares down the mob boss and hits him with a hard no. He tries playing the soft boy card, acting like it was a harmless question, but she wrecks his act. You aren't asking, she tells him. You're giving an order. Honestly, this is a total masterclass in dealing with a manipulative ex, and the life lesson hits hard. The worst kind of cage isn't made of iron bars. Sometimes, the absolute most brutal trap you can ever step into looks exactly like a warm, loving hug.
Notice gracefully if the shadows are literally closing while Julia brings up the elephant in the room, the insane garden talk where his mafia blood money wrecked their marriage.
Matteo uses his smooth villain voice to spin his usual lies, but she is having none of it. Heavily pregnant, she forces herself up, hands shaking on the desk. Take the offer, she demands like an absolute boss. But as she turns to bounce, this guy steps right into the doorway. He turns into a brick wall of expensive suits and terrifying mob energy, cutting off her only escape.
Life lesson is totally
Undeniable.
you can never sit around waiting for the guy who locked you up to hand over the keys.
If you want real freedom, you have to stand on your own shaking leg and walk out yourself. You and I really need to talk about how Mateo dominates the screen here. Look at his shoulders as he blocks his wife from the hallway. He leaves a tiny gap, but his dark mob boss energy literally sucks all the oxygen out of the air. You look exhausted, he whispers, using this dangerous puppy dog look to weaponize his affection. Julia is fully bracing for him to snap, but instead, he hits her with fake calculated empathy. Her jaw clenches as she goes into pure survival mode. "Let me take you to lunch," he says, dropping the words like a massive trap. This brings us a brutal life lesson. When a guy holding all the power tells you to sit down and eat with him, it is never just a friendly invite. It is always a hardcore command wrapped up in a fancy velvet box. The camera literally zooms in on his hands right here. You can see the dark Mafia tattoos on his knuckles flexing as he grips the doorframe with hidden rage. He scans her up and down, finding all her weak spots. "You need to eat," he orders, leaving zero room for argument. She lifts her chin, terrified but acting tough, warning him that getting food won't change her mind. Then Mateo pulls a massive plot twist. "I know," he whispers. "Listen up. When a toxic villain admits defeat, he isn't actually giving up. He is just reloading his weapons." Julia finally cracks and agrees to give him 1 single hour. "Just us," he purrs like an absolute creep. The life lesson here hits hard. Never give a single hour of your bright future to the toxic person who already wasted all the best years of your past. The tragedy about Julia is she totally sees the trap coming. She knows isolating her is how he keeps her hooked. When he says, "just us," it's a toxic magic spell, dragging her right back in. They end up in this dark restaurant, so nobody sees the mob boss at work. Watch how this guy takes total control, grabbing the corner booth and ordering her water without looking at a menu. He remembers everything she hates. To a random waiter, he looks like the ultimate loving husband. But we know it's a terrifying flex of power to prove he still owns her. The life lesson is simple. Real love gives you the freedom to choose your own path. A controlling person makes every choice for you and just expects you to sit there and smile while trapped inside a fancy cage. Look at how terrifying Mateo's brain is here. The guy's mind is a creepy supercomputer, memorizing every little thing his wife likes. Early on, that obsessive vibe felt like romance, but now it's straight up stalking. He asks about the baby, sounding like a detective interrogating a suspect.
Normal.
She snaps, refusing to give him any ammo. Then, without blinking, he drops a piece of bread on her plate. It's such a normal husband move, burned into his brain from years together. Their deadly relationship is literally haunting the table. She hates the gesture, but stays quiet. This gives us a rough life lesson. Honestly, sometimes the ghosts of your comfy old routines are way harder to shake off than the actual toxic ex you finally ran away from.
The shadows out the bath to be connected.
But he gives be wearing a fancy suit of the energy of an absolute killer. He's basically a hungry wolf chilling at dinner. As the camera zooms in on Julia, you can see anyone falling to her side. Her eyes fill with tears because she actually misses this psycho. This is why trauma bonds are terrifying. Her brain is begging for the guy who ruined her life. She digs her nails into her hands to snap back to reality, realizing this feeling is just emotional detox. The life lesson is deep, guys. Just because you miss the person who destroyed your peace, it doesn't mean leaving was a mistake. It just means your heart is going through withdrawal while it finally heals. The whole vibe just flipped upside down here. Matteo drops a bomb, demanding to be in the delivery room when the baby is born. Look at his face. This is elite nice psychological warfare. Big bad mob boss drops his cold armor and suddenly looks like a heartbroken dad. It is honesty terrifying. Top tier manipulator knows exactly when to cry real tears just to mess with your head. Julia sleepy breathing for a second. She sees a glimpse of the guy she used to love, and it completely scrambles her brain. She looks away, but because she can't match this crying dad while the absolute might monster she ran from. The life lesson here is crucial for your sanity. One single moment of real tears from a toxic ex never cancels out the years of pure trauma they dragged you through. The camera pans to the city outside, showing how the world has no clue about the crazy mental warfare happening at this table. I will think about it, Julia whispers. Matteo nods, putting on an Oscar-worthy performance of a calm guy. Then a heavy silence drops. In that quiet moment, you can see her falling back into the fantasy. Her broken heart desperately wants to believe he is just a misunderstood husband. But surviving a Mafia boss takes willpower. Her knuckles go white, gripping the table, and she rebuilds her mental walls on the spot. She leans in, staring right into his cold, dead eyes. There is something you should know, she tells him. The life lesson is clear. When sitting in silence with a toxic person starts feeling way too cozy, you have to find the absolute courage to finally speak up. You can see how pointless it is trying to explain feelings to an absolute narcissist. Her voice shakes while she spills the truth. Running away wasn't just about his mafia blood in the garden. It was the crushing weight of living inside his unhinged head. She breaks down the nightmare of loving a guy who only cares about power. I felt like a room in your house, she tells him. Beautifully decorated, but locked behind a heavy door. She hits him with the hardest truth, saying his obsession with protecting her is the exact same thing as locking her up. In his twisted brain, loving someone and controlling them are the same word. Matteo freezes, totally stunned by this reality check. The life lesson here is brutal. A fancy, golden cage is still a prison, no matter how much they polish the shiny bars. The mafia tattoos on his neck flex as the reality of her words finally hits him. This scene is a total mental earthquake for the mob boss. You are right, he whispers into the dark. He stares at his hands, confessing how messed up he is. The dude literally cannot tell the difference between having a relationship and running a military operation. I handled you, he admits. Just think about that word for a second. Handled. He is using the ruthless sling of the underworld to describe his own wife. He didn't see a partner. He saw a pretty problem that needed constant security checks.
The dead silence in that room is the sound of his ego breaking to pieces. The lifeless is terrifying. You can never build a cozy,
loving home with a guy who only knows how to build concrete war bunkers. Stick with me here, because his tough defense is about to completely crumble. Julia watches him, demanding to know why he is suddenly so self-aware. He just points at her baby bump. The camera zooms in on his tired eyes as he admits he ordered his goons to track her every move. You had me stalked, she fires back, ripping away his fake romantic mask. He leans in, desperately trying to convince himself that spying on her was true love. There is a difference, he begs, his voice cracking. There really is not, she replies, staring at him with ice in her veins.
For the first time ever, the crime boss has zero comeback. I know, he whispers in defeat. The lesson here is scary but true. If a guy has to spy on you just to feel secure, That isn't love.
He just wants to own you completely.
Let me tell you, her escapist fear movie, the betrayal, that bolts back to Turin, completely ghosting her legal team. Picture her on the train, glued to the window, arms wrapped tight around her stomach.
Whispering promises to her unborn baby. Trauma survivors get this reaction perfectly. You grab the closest anchor. She mutters that he is never what she expects. Man, that is the ultimate trap. Unpredictability hooks your brain on the adrenaline of the unknown. She finally makes it to her friend Serena's house, leaving the Mafia underworld for a sunny safe haven. It brings up a very real truth. Sometimes, the absolute strongest armor you can wear against a walking nightmare is just the open door of a genuinely good friend. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? The camera opens on Serena, who is not playing games. The second Julia walks in, Serena demands the raw truth. Julia sighs and spills the craziest tea. Her Mafia boss husband is
acting way out of character. Instead of his usual toxic blame, the Don actually gave her a real apology. Due to that kind of emotional whiplash will completely fry your brain.
Serena sits in freezing silence as Julia admits he confessed to treating her like a literal business deal. We need to catch the dark irony here. When the guy who ruined your life suddenly starts using therapeutic, and he is just putting on a more dangerous mask to reel you back in. Here is the bottom line. An apology without changed behavior is pure manipulation wearing a really expensive suit. Serena goes dead silent. That quiet is way louder than a scream. She asks the one question that totally guts you. Does Julia actually believe his fake act? Julia breaks down his motives like a science project. She thinks he believes his own lies, but lying to yourself does not fix a rotten soul. Serena savagely turns the mirror back on her friend. It is never about whether the bad guy can magically change, but if you are crazy enough to burn in his fire while he tries. 3 days drag by before her safe bubble pops. A nameless number lights up her phone. She answers, and a creepy voice slithers through the speaker. It is a massive wake-up call. You can run fast, but until you completely cut the cord, your dark past will always track down your new zip code. Pay close attention to how a real predator operates. The caller knows exactly how to weaponize fear, dropping the Mafia name. She gave up everything to escape. Watch Julia's nose turn totally white, her panic hammering against her ribs. "Who is this?" she demands, her voice shaking. The stranger just purrs, playing the role of a polite friend. But the second she shuts him down, the gloves come off. He coldly reminds her that the kid inside us eyed her carries the family blood, turning her baby into a high-value business piece. Her blood runs cold. She tells him to back off and slams the phone down.
Pretending the wolf is gone will never save you. The hardest truth to swallow is that ignoring our deepest problems only gives them way more time to sharpen their teeth in the dark.
She sits in a dark room, paralyzed by shock. Running on the instinct of someone battered for years, she dials the monster she bled to escape. Matteo picks up on the first ring. "I have been waiting for you," he whispers. When she chokes out the threat details, the phone goes dead silent. It is the terrifying pause of an apex predator locking on to prey. She describes the guy and his rough voice. The silence that follows has zero mercy. When Matteo says her name, that wounded husband act totally evaporates. Out steps the ruthless kingpin, the guy she used to hear ordering hits in the night. It is a brutal warning. You can dress someone up in soft apologies, but when real danger hits, their truest, a violent nature is always going to rip right through the disguise. His voice is pure iron now, demanding she surrender. He orders her back to Milan. When she fights back, watch this masterclass in toxic mind games. He instantly flips the script, playing the protective hero.
If they have your number, he warns, your safe house is blown. Panic hits her hard. Her shaking hand drops to guard her belly. Who are these guys?
She begs. His hesitation is straight up terrifying. He admits they are rival mobsters, looking for a weakness, guys he failed to wipe out. This exposes a massive flaw in powerful people. They will risk losing everything before they admit they have lost their grip on the wheel. Control is just a fake illusion. Fighting like crazy to keep it usually ends up destroying the exact people we claim to care about. A manipulator only drops the truth when they can use it as a weapon. Julia asks if this is the bloody mess he deals with in the shadows. He does not dodge, he just begs her best to come back. Right on cue, the baby kicks, like it feels the weight of her giving up. She caves. Then, next morning, a black sedan rolls up. Matteo did not send random muscle. He sent Enzo, his absolute deadliest hitman. Enzo steps out holding fresh coffee, radiating a creepy, calm energy. This is exactly how the trap snaps shut. Enzo plays the nice guy, wrapping insane mafia violence in a blanket of normal life. The lesson here will chill your blood. The most dangerous threats almost never come screaming. They are usually quietly pouring you a warm cup of coffee while the house burns down around you. Look closely at Serena. She packs her bags without blinking. Enzo does not try to stop her, exposing how desperate Matteo is. The long drive back to Milan is suffocating. Serena falls asleep, but Enzo drives with the focus of a soldier behind enemy lines. Julia stares out the tinted window, totally numb. Then Enzo drops a heavy bomb in a quiet voice. He tells her Matteo stayed awake until 4 in the morning, personally locking down security for her arrival. You do not need to tell me that, she snaps. But the seed is planted. The hitman is chipping away at her defenses, selling her the fake idea of the boss being devoted. This is a tragic reality. We constantly mistake toxic obsession for real love, willingly putting the heavy chains back on to be close to the hands that broke us. Let us unpack this car ride together, because what you and I are watching is pure mental warfare. Enzo casually admits he tracked Julia in Turin the whole time. He spins this stalking behavior, framing himself as her personal bodyguard. It is the same twisted logic Matteo uses, but because Enzo is so polite, Julia feels her anger fading. She confesses how desperately she wants to be safe. Enzo validates her panics, swearing he has never seen the Don drowning in so much guilt. This reveals how much we crave validation, even from the people hurting us. When an enemy admits you are in pain, your walls naturally crash down. But we have to remember one simple truth. Just because someone points out that you are bleeding does not mean they are going to drop the knife. An average toxic guy throws out a cheap apology before blaming you, but Matteo genuinely looks buried under the wreckage of his own choices. Julia keeps her poker face locked, her hand guarding her unborn baby as the car pulls up to the estate. This fortress is basically his controlling brain made of solid rock and creepy shadows. After 6 months of freedom, she thought this place would feel alien. But the second she breathes in that familiar smell of polished stone, her racing heart slows down. It brings on a sickening wave of comfort, and that is the real tragedy of a toxic bond. When you survive in darkness for years, stepping back into the shadows feels exactly like a warm hug. In life, we constantly make the fatal mistake of confusing a familiar cage with a genuinely safe home. Matteo lingers in the dark corners of the grand foyer. A boss that can never look desperate, because that means giving up. He waits by the stairs, his tattoos out on display. His eyes lock onto her face, then drop straight to her baby bump. A look of terrifying ownership flashes across his face. Thank you for coming, he whispers. I did not return for you, she snaps, trying to build a quick emotional wall. Our child, he corrects her in a smooth voice and ripping the weapon right out of her hands. He mentions netting up the east bedroom, carefully avoiding calling it hers. It is a devastating psychological power play. A brilliant predator knows exactly how much slack to leave on the leash. Giving someone the illusion of choice is the easiest way to make sure they never actually walk away. You remembered I prefer the eastern light, she says. I remember everything, he replies, his tone flat. We have to look closely at this trap together. Weaponizing tiny details makes someone feel profoundly seen, wrapping them in a fake sense of value. Later, they sit with Roya silent. Dinner. Afterward, he does not bark an order. He gently asks her to take a walk. It is a soft request, handing her that addictive illusion of freedom. They drift into the dark garden. He keeps a respectful distance, dropping his physical dominance like an old jacket. It is a terrifying upgrade in his control. Tell me about the threat, she demands, willingly marching into the jaws of the beast. The hardest cage to break out of is always the one we lock ourselves inside, totally convinced we are holding the key. Pause frame right here, because this is absolute cinema. Watch this untouchable Mafia mastermind straight up confess his fatal flaw. His Mateo's true isn't his Endler bank accounts. Nope, it is Julia. And the craziest part, Mateo looks her dead in the eyes and agrees. He drops the tough guy act, admitting he would gladly burn his entire underground empire to ash just to keep her safe. It is a wildly twisted devotion, but man, it hits hard. Here is a ruthless Don who solves every problem with a bullet, totally paralyzed by his feelings. Which brings us to a life lesson. The massive walls we would to keep the dangerous world out usually end up trapping us inside with our softest vulnerabilities. Even for a boss, love makes a hostage of us all. The camera pushes in on Julia, standing alone in the bitter frost. Months ago, she bolted from this estate, swearing she would never let this mobster near her again. But now, the moonlight catches her exhale as that certainty turns to dust. You can literally see the exact frame where this wildly toxic bond hooks its claws right back into her brain. Her hands shake against her coat. Terrified of her own surrender, she bolts for the door, reacting exactly how any of us would. Meanwhile, Mateo stays in the dark, watching her run and promising a bloodbath for tomorrow. Here is a harsh truth. The most terrifying thing is not the monster waiting for you in the cold dark. It is the sudden, sickening realization that a small part of you actually wants that monster to catch you. Let's hold on this exact shot to soak in the crazy irony. Julia lingers on the threshold, whispering a quiet thank you for putting their baby first. She is fighting this insane magnetic pull between them. As she steps right back into the cage she risked her life to break out of, Mateo stays planted in the frost. The amber light catches the faded loyalty tattoo on his neck. For 20 years, that ink meant spilling blood for the syndicate slogan. Now his whole identity is fracturing behind those dark eyes. He is the shield guarding her from the wolves, but he is still the warden holding the heavy keys. The lesson here cuts deep. True loyalty is not about taking a bullet. Real love is having the agonizing strength to let someone walk away when you know that keeping them will only break them. Cut to 3 a.m. The bedroom is swallowed in suffocating shadows. That fragile illusion of peace Julia just built, shattered instantly. She snaps awake to the sound of shouted Italian drifting up from the freezing courtyard. Her eyes dart to the window. She knows that sound. Syndicate soldiers scrambling to plug a massive security breach. She curls up tight, her shaking fingers protecting her stomach, paralyzed by the horrific fact that this gang war has literally bled right onto her doorstep. The camera lingers on her terrified eyes, serving up an unforgiving reality check about trauma. You simply cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that broke you in the first place, no matter how thick those stone walls are, or how many heavily armed guards patrolled the gates. Stick with me here, because you and I need to unpack what she does next. Her body just takes over entirely. There is zero conscious thought, just a pure trauma response driving her. She throws a robe on and slips toward the window, hiding in the shadows. Below, the courtyard is pure chaos. A guard is frantically waving a grainy photograph while a sweating lieutenant delivers catastrophic news. After 30 seconds of watching this mess, Julia totally discards every boundary she fought so hard to build. She marches straight down to the ground floor study, her bare feet silent on the freezing marble. It reveals a brutal truth about survival. Fear might teach us the rules of the game, but when your actual life is on the line, you will shatter every single rule without a second thought. The camera sweeps into the dim study, finding Matteo bathed in the harsh glow of desk lamps. His jacket is tossed aside, sleeves pushed up, exposing that dark syndicate ink. The old boss would have barked at her to go back upstairs and play the obedient wife. But tonight is different. He steps aside without a word, letting her stare at the grainy surveillance photos on his desk. Look closely. It is her old apartment lobby back in Turin. A rival operative was inside her supposedly safe building. Matteo isn't even trying to shield her from the terror anymore. This reminds us of a terrifying truth about toxic control. True power is not always about micromanaging someone. Sometimes it is about stepping back and letting the brutal outside world convince them they desperately need you to survive. The lighting shifts, casting hollow shadows across Julia's face as her stomach drops. Matteo is unnervingly calm, revealing those stalker photos were taken hours after she ran away. Her eyes lock onto a blurred figure near the elevator in the printouts. It is her best friend, Serena. Blinding panic spikes in her chest. But Matteo steps in smoothly, putting out the fire with a single sentence. He casually mentions his men already secured Serena and are bringing her to the estate. He saw this rival strike coming and positioned himself as the ultimate savior. You and I really need to recognize this dark reality. The dangerous predators don't drag you kicking into a cage. They simply make the outside world so deadly that you willingly walk inside and lock the heavy iron door yourself. Let's unpack the twisted psychology unfolding here. Matteo leans his weight onto the desk, the lamplight catching the dark mob ink creeping up his forearm. He explains a horrific gang situation with the chilling calm of a guy just ordering an espresso. He tells Julia that out in Turin, she was an easy target for Duca, but inside these walls, she is protected by 30 heavy hitters who would swallow a bullet before letting a stranger near the door. It sounds logical, right? Yet, hiding beneath that gentle tone is a masterclass in psychological isolation, quietly severing her from the outside world entirely. It brings us to a harsh but meaningful reality. True manipulation rarely holds a knife to your throat. Most of the time, it arrives offering a fortress to keep you safe. Now he plays his ultimate trump card. His voice drops, reminding Julia she is his wife, the woman grinning his heir. He pins her with an intense stare engineered to make anyone unravel. But the camera stays locked on Julia. She strains her spine, steps back from his magnetic pull, and demands the actual tactical plan. Guys, she is fighting off a deep trauma bond in real time. Surprisingly, the arrogant Mafia kingpin actually pivots. He drops his condescending armor and speaks to her like an equal, mapping out exactly how Duca is bleeding his northern territory dry. It leaves us with a painful truth. Real growth always demands that we drop our emotional defenses. But for a seasoned criminal mastermind, even brutal honesty is just another highly calculated weapon. The lens tightens on the tragic rot at the core of this syndicate lifestyle. Matteo clenches his jaw, saying he used to handle bloody turf wars by tossing away small scraps of territory. But criminal greed has no ceiling. Duca wants the entire northern network, and when Matteo refused, the rival aimed a target directly at Giulia. Self-hatred flashes in his eyes as he admits his biggest failure. He is only now forming an alliance with 3 rival families, a move he delayed because his suffocating picky could not stomach asking anyone for help. It leaves us with a clear, grounded lesson. When the stakes are life and death, an inflated ego is your most fatal vulnerability. You either get to protect your fragile pride or you get to protect your actual life. You never get to keep both. We seriously have to admire Giulia in this exact moment. She does not miss a beat. She stares into the eyes of this terrifying mafia boss and plainly states that his ridiculous pride almost got her murdered. A typical narcissist would explode into a rage, but Minato just takes the hit. He offers a cold nod, clearly testing a new psychological strategy. For a split second, they should ghost of a smile over how fractured their shared reality is. She glances down at his scarred knuckles, quietly asking what her role is in all this mess. He simply tells her to stay safe inside while he handles the blood outside. It teaches us a profound lesson about human nature. A deeply lalured person can easily tell you the honest truth, provided that truth perfectly serves their own selfish endgame. Stick with me, because the mental gymnastics here are staggering. Matteo outlines a newly involved system of control. Previously, he would have locked her away to maintain his suffocating dominance. Now, he packages the isolation as a pragmatic division of labor. He manages the violence outside, while she keeps their baby safe inside. He insists it is just logical resource management. But Giulia sees right through the cracks. It is the exact same primal possession, just dressed up in a tailored suit. The silent gaze of Matteo actually agrees with her. She almost reaches out to touch his face, but pulls her hand back at the last second, and it leaves us with a heartbreaking essential lesson. No matter how much shiny gold you paint on the heavy iron bars, an upgraded cage is still a cage. Instead of falling for a cliché romantic moment, Giulia shuts off her emotions. She looks this terrifying mafia boss in the eye void, cold as ice, and tells him to sleep just so he can be useful. Matteo is left frozen behind his desk, his tough guy armor shattered. She walks out, leaving him to choke on his crumbling empire. Cut to the next morning. Serena is marched right in, radiating the rage of a normal person dragged into a messy syndicate war. Over a super tense breakfast, Giulia spills the brutal truth about the underworld. And guys, here is a massive life lesson. Keeping dark secrets is exactly what encapsulation breathing.
Into the the fake illusion dies for good.
Serena stands in this massive estate, the heavy marble columns looking exactly like prison bars. She spots this fancy cage and instantly calls out the red flag. Giulia is still hopelessly chained to the kingpin. Lowering her head, Giulia admits to this crazy invisible pull, muting her survival instincts. Serena drops a total truth bomb, saying human attachment survives without an ounce of logic. Giulia tries to defend him, even knowing his neglect hurt just as much as his violence. Then Serena hits her with the ultimate question. Has this man truly changed his soul? Here is a serious life lesson. Excusing the person who breaks you is the very first chain of captivity. We cling to the ghost of who they might be, completely blinding ourselves to the reality, standing right in front of us. The camera zooms in on Julia sitting in silence. She replays the moment. The boss lowered his guard, and a tragic spark of hope flickers. She almost believes the monster is tamed. Then, her shaking hand drifts to her stomach. Feeling the kick of her unborn baby, her worst nightmare spills out. She is terrified. His gentle act is just a mask. Matteo is completely boxed in by Mafia rivals. He only plays the vulnerability card because his usual violence cannot win this war. Serena forces her to face the ugly truth. The life lesson here is harsh but entirely real. A temporary surrender is never a permanent cure. A cornered predator does not suddenly become a good person. True change only happens when someone holds absolute power and still actively chooses mercy. Julia stares off, stripped of her defenses. Days into her captivity, Matteo calls a massive Mafia council. Now, you and I need to watch Julia closely here. She stands her ground, refusing to step inside that toxic room. She knows it is better to watch a venomous world from the outside than let it drag you under. For 4 agonizing hours, she listens to the roaring of violent men echoing through the heavy doors. When the chaos stops, Matteo finds her. He collapses into a chair, his Mafia boss armor completely gone. He leans forward, staring at the floor like a broken man. This gives us a massive life lesson. Setting a strict boundary is never about trying to tame a chaotic person. It is simply about building an iron fortress to protect your own mental peace. Matteo confesses the brutal ultimatum he delivered. His rival must accept the new borders, or the syndicate will tear him to shreds. Julia spots a bitter truth. Men poisoned by a massive god complex never want to die. They push their luck until reality punches them in the mouth. Hunting Julia was just the pathetic thrashing of a collapsing ego. But she notes a cornered mobster is capable of horrors. Matteo confirms her fear. 30 armed enforcers will state until the treaty is signed. She sits there, fighting to stay grounded. Here is the life lesson we need to understand. Genuine safety is never found by trusting the fake promises of a cornered predator. Real safety is only secured when you are the one holding the absolute key to their cage. When Julia says she has to leave, the kingpin does not flinch. He stares into her eyes and softly whispers, "I know." He perfectly engineers his tone, making it sound like her departure is ripping his heart to pieces. He promises he will not force her to stay. It is a terrifying performance. He disguises a dark command as a painful sacrifice, painting Arstifice's tyranny a prediction. Here is a harsh life lesson. You must never confuse a toxic person loosening the leash with actual freedom. The real tragedy is that the heart desperately wants to believe the warden is a savior. A sick feeling hits her stomach. Right on cue, he springs the velvet trap. He asks if she might move to Milan when the baby is born. Not inside his fortress, but just close enough to keep his absolute grip on her life. Stick with me. This is where it gets wild. He wraps his trap in calculated vulnerability, offering an apartment to build an illusion of independence. Like an actor, his voice breaks. He whispers that he just wants to be close enough to see the small moments. He guilt-trips her about missing 6 months of the pregnancy, dropping a massive weight of guilt onto her shoulders. This reveals a truly tragic life lesson. The most inescapable cages in life are always the ones we willingly lock ourselves inside. A heavy silence stretches out, breaking only when she quietly murmurs that she will think about it in That is the exact phrase she used at the divorce office. In that quiet second, you can practically hear the cold iron snapping right back onto her wrists. A bleak light washes over the estate. For trauma survivors, simple routines are often the only thing keeping them sane. She paces the gravel paths, letting the freezing wind clear her head. This reminds us of a very real life lesson. Our revelations usually surface when we force ourselves into the uncomfortable cold. Suddenly, his massive frame blocks the doorway. The pale light catches the history tattooed on his arms, projecting pure dominance. It is finished, he announces to the empty air. He does not show an ounce of relief, because Mobovos never lets himself look weak. Still, his rigid shoulders drop a tiny fraction. Julia deflects the heavy tension by asking about Serena. He replies with a chilling, casual tone that her friend is completely free to leave. A fragile laugh escapes her lips, an emotional fracture that stuns them both. He stares at her, his face stripped of its lethal edge. For one heartbeat, he wears the exact tender look from their wedding day. There's a brief slip before his icy defenses snap back. She swallows the bitter laugh, staring at the gravel. "I am going to go home soon," she whispers, gripping her crumbling shield. This brings us to a vital life lesson. Real boundaries must be forged from solid steel in your soul long before they ever cross your lips. "I know," he replies, his voice like dark velvet. She looks up, her breath catching. He has already erased the physical distance between them. He towers in her personal space, pulling a calculated alpha move that makes the rest of the world vanish. The tattoos on his throat rest inches from her eyes, a monument to his control. "I have something to say," he murmurs, seizing the scene. He begs her to listen and not build a fortress in her mind. "You and I are going to watch how flawlessly he dismantles her armor. This is a massive life lesson. Anyone who asks you to drop your critical thoughts is secretly preparing to pull your strings." She freezes, locked in the stillness of hunted prey, and weakly agrees to listen. He draws a heavy breath. His twitching fingers betray a violent urge to just grab her. "When I stood at that window," he begins, "I want to be honest." The world goes dead quiet. He perfectly describes the chilling detachment of a monster calmly preparing to burn the world to ashes. Pay close attention right now. We are watching a masterclass in how a toxic soul justifies his own ruin. He stares into her eyes, declaring he finally recognizes his failure. He claims his biggest mistake was creating a world where leaving him became her only logical choice. It is a breathtaking illusion of accountability. He paints himself as a tormented king who only wanted to keep his queen safe, admitting that standing near a fire leaves you burned. He insists he is no longer the dictator who tore her life apart, but a fractured man will always rewrite history to cast himself as the misunderstood hero. The life lesson here is harsh but deeply necessary, a beautiful, poetic apology that is never backed up by real behavioral change is just a fresh coat of paint on a very old cage. "I know I must earn your trust back," he whispers. He times every pause to make his performance feel raw. His jaw tightens, playing a broken man, fighting a tragic inner war. He says she might decide he is not worth the pain, and he will accept it. He hands her the absolute illusion of supremacy. For a woman starved of choice, this is an intoxicating poison. He promises to accept whatever she wants. Then comes the fatal emotional blow. "You are not just a room in my house," he rasps. "You were the reason the house had any meaning." It breaks your heart until you remember a massive life lesson. Being worshipped as a rare possession is never the same thing as being genuinely loved. The wind rattles the branches, and in that freezing silence, her trauma bond locks firmly back into place. Let us pause the camera right here and look at the absolute wreckage they just created. We have Julia staring down a guy literally built to destroy things. Mateo is a heavy-hitting mob boss who wrecked her life, and now he is standing there genuinely confused that everything is in ashes. She strips away his defenses, spelling out the agony he caused. It was never just one mistake. It was a toxic chokehold he mistook for true romance. He mumbles that he knows, but she demands the raw facts. Finally, this untouchable Mafia king drops his hands and admits his own deep fears out loud into the freezing air. The lesson here is crystal clear. Real love does not demand a ransom, and true affection should never feel like a hostage situation. Look closely at the wild irony happening in this exact frame. The most feared guy in the underworld is totally exposed, spilling a fear he has kept bottled up for 20 solid years. He is basically handing her a loaded gun just because she asked for something genuine. When she presses him, the camera zooms in on his broken face. His answer is pure pain. He is terrified he will shatter her all over again. He knows his brain is wired for total domination, not actual trust. She holds eye contact, seeing the permanent cracks in his soul. It is a massive tragedy playing out in real time. The brutal truth we have to accept is this. Admitting your toxic red flags without putting in the work to change is just booking a VIP ticket for your next massive disaster. She cuts him a tiny bit of slack, seeing that he is self-aware for once. He nods, knowing perfectly well that awareness does not fix the damage. But man, the universe has wild timing. Right then, the baby suddenly kicks hard. It is a natural reflex to the deep bass of Mateo speaking. Without thinking, Julia blurts out that the kid moves whenever he talks. Boom. That single sentence absolutely flattens him. The untouchable kingpin freezes, and decades of violent armor just melt away. His dark eyes drop to her stomach, totally wrecked by a reality he cannot punch his way out of. The lesson here hits incredibly deep. Your body will always snitch on your brain, spilling the absolute truth, even when you try to hide behind a massive fortress of lies. Watching a guy who decides who lives and dies suddenly beg for permission is top-tier cinema. He whispers a question he cannot even finish. She spots the sheer panic in his eyes and actually guides his heavy hand over. The wild visual contrast here, those brutal, scarred knuckles resting gently against her stomach. They freeze in the winter breeze, and then the baby kicks again. The boss shuts his eyes, letting out a shaky breath, totally paralyzed by something so tiny. He mutters about the kid being strong, blind to the crazy irony of his own destructive nature. The truth here is a massive part of the human experience. Real power has nothing to do with the damage you can cause. It is entirely about the restraint shown you when holding all the cards. Let us step back and watch this messy, doomed moment play out. He stares at her, completely stripped of his mob boss swagger, struggling to find words. She begs him to stop talking, her tired heart totally overriding her logic. He promises not to push, but he drops a bomb anyway. He calls her the most vital piece of his life, a truth he hid for 2 long years. As someone watching this drama unfold, you just want to scream at her, run, but instead she ignores her survival instincts and rests her head right on the chest of the monster who ruined her. The hardest pill to swallow in this life is actually pretty simple. You can feel deep sympathy for the person who broke you, but letting that sympathy override your own basic survival is a guaranteed fatal mistake. Zoom in on the crazy physical space between them right here, there. This is not some romantic movie hug. The shot shows 2 exhausted people leaning on each other there because life got way too heavy. He is terrified to even grip her, standing as stiff as a board, stroking her back exactly one time. When she finally steps away, that cold defense snaps right back into her eyes. She fixes her coat and drops the news is that she's heading to Turin. He takes the brutal hit without a single word. But wait, she leaves the door cracked, hinting she might hit up Milan later. The cold reality of this scene hits like a truck. Genuine healing demands actual physical distance. If with you stay chained to the exact person causing your pain, you will just keep bleeding out until absolutely nothing is left. You and I have to pause here and look at this massive shift in the power dynamic. Matteo is playing a totally different game now. When his terrifying mob boss tactics completely fail, he pivots instantly. He offers to pay for whatever she needs, perfectly dressing his desperate control as gentle kindness. He is still moving the chess pieces, but now he uses a soft voice. She sees through it and holds her ground. She dips out to Turin, renting a basic 4th-floor apartment just so she can finally hear herself think. It is an absolute masterclass in self-preservation.
Peace. You've to walk away, build your own safe zone from scratch.
The scene kicks off with her packing up her bags, surviving on pure mental clarity. She hits the 30-week mark, gets the clear from her doctor, and decides to play a crazy, dangerous move against the syndicate. She completely ghosts Mayo. The only breadcrumb she tosses him is a single photo of a sunny nursery. It is a ridiculously smart surgical strike. His reaction? Pure ego, shattering panic. He texts back a single loaded curse word. The guy is totally losing his mind because he cannot manage his own air. She stares at her phone, sees the massive cracks in his tough guy act, and quietly starts looking for spots right in his own city. The reality here is deadly serious. Absolute silence is the sharpest weapon you can use against a control freak who constantly demands your attention. The camera sweeps across a gorgeous flat in the Navigli district. High ceilings, vintage tiles, and warm sunlight. It is the exact opposite of his creepy, fortified Mafia mansion. When she drops the bomb that she is moving to Milan, you can literally see the panic fry his brain. He does the math and realizes she waited until week 34, the last second she can travel. His mob boss reflex kicks in, ready to deploy his muscle, but he catches himself, swallowing the command and acting like it is just a friendly suggestion. Still, he asks to sweep the area for threats. She instantly shuts that nonsense down. The lesson is undeniable. When you are putting your life back together, you have to fiercely defend your new boundaries against anyone trying to step over them. Now, the mental warfare hits absolute peak levels. She casually corners him about Valentina, that sketchy chick hanging out by the gate. Watch his body language snap straight into defense mode. He stumbles, carefully spinning a story, admitting they had a past, but swearing he cut her off. For a dude with a massive god complex, admitting a mistake is huge.
But Julia, walking lie detector now. In a split second, she links Tina straight to the recent mob attacks. The dead silence over the phone line is cinematic to perfection.
He is completely paralyzed because she connected the invisible dots before he did. The hard truth to carry with you is this: never underestimate the razor-sharp instincts of someone who had to study your toxic habits every single day just to survive. She coldly reminds him exactly who she is. She is a bookkeeper's daughter, and her brain is hardwired to spot broken patterns. Cornered, Matteo finally spills the ugly truth. Valentina was the rat selling out his operation. He drops a chilling line about Valentina not being an issue anymore, which is straight up Mafia slang for a permanent grave. When Julia flames him for the lies, he instantly weaponizes his guilt, turning it around to blame her for leaving. She snaps back, calling herself his ex-wife. But he smoothly slides the dagger in, pointing out that those divorce papers are still completely unsigned. The life lesson here cuts incredibly deep. Keeping dark secrets under the excuse of protecting someone is almost always a selfish lie meant to protect your own comfort. Stick with me as we unpack this brutal final frame together. She blinks, completely blindsided by his logic. Her lawyer filed an extension, meaning she secretly stalled the final blow herself. She whispers her dark confession. She not denying them. The silence that drops is insanely heavy, packed with their toxic addiction to each other. The scene hard cuts to a freezing December morning. She is 32 weeks pregnant, watching his silent souls haul her boxes into the new apartment. They call her Sonora, keeping their eyes respectfully glued to the floor. The profound lesson hidden here is heartbreaking. Sometimes we stall our own great escape, leaving the back door open just in case the monster we are running from magically turns into a saint.
Alright guys, picture this. Midday sunlight is hitting this soft gray rug, lighting up a pristine white dresser and a tiny baby mobile just chilling in the breeze. The Mafia boss's literal ninja crew.
Poof, was ghosted, leaving our girl in her brand new, totally independent sanctuary. We gotta look at this together, you and I. This isn't his heavily armed fortress, okay? This is a massive flex of her freedom. She is finally vibing with true safety, feeling so bossed up, she drops him a casual text for lunch. 2 seconds later, his reply lights up her screen. Dude insists on delivering the food himself, low-key trying to mask his obsessive control as caring. Big yikes. Here is a simple life lesson for you. Taking absolute ownership of your own space is just the man to first aim to ripping your soul back from the toxic hands that broke it. The camera hangs there, catching her finally breathing real, unfiltered air. She is exactly 7 weeks out from having this baby. But at noon, the chill vibes absolutely shatter. The heavy door swings open, and there is the big bad wolf himself. His dark coat hangs loose, sleeves pushed down to hide the venomous tattoos scarring his neck. In his lethal hands, take out from a tiny spot she randomly name-dropped 18 months ago. Power-obsessed dudes literally never forget a detail if it buys your loyalty. He steps inside, instantly scanning the shadows and mapping the exits like a literal Terminator. It is wildly intense to watch. But here is a simple life lesson, guys. People rarely ever shed their deepest, most violent survival instincts. They simply change the lighting of the rooms where they choose to use them. The second is a paranoid brain confirms no rival assassins are hiding in the corners. The tension totally melts out of his massive shoulders. The most terrifying boss in the city stops dead in front of her delicate white dresser, shoving his lethal hands deep into his pockets. "It is good," he whispers, barely scraping the thin walls. "I know." She claps back, tilting her chin up and fully owning her newfound boss energy. For a split second, his mouth actually twitches into an exhausted smile. They sit down at her cheap table, eating stupidly expensive food, trading baby names like rival warlords, splitting up turf. It is crazy to watch, but here is a simple life lesson. Real equality only ever breathes when two damaged people can consider crossing from each other, and absolutely nobody holds the key to lock the door. The vibe in that cramped room is hard, throwing gritty shadows across his scarred face. He is staring at her with that terrifying eyeing who she usually saves for wiping out rival mob families. He tosses back his own baby names, flipping a hostage dynamic into a quiet standoff. But once the empty plates are pushed aside, The air literally turns to ice. I need to tell you something, she says, her voice shaking just a bit. She drops the bomb that her running away last January wasn't just some tactical retreat. It was way darker. This is where the drama peaks. Guys, here is a life lesson that hits deep. Running blindly into the night is a totally useless move unless you finally turn around and faces the absolute terror of why you let yourself decay in the dark for so long. Stick with me here, because this is where the plot absolutely shreds your feelings. The camera pushes in super close as she stares down at her shaking hands, dropping the sickest secret of their toxic relationship. She didn't just run from his violent Mafia empire. She bolted because the sheer weight of her feelings for an actual monster completely horrified her. Just imagine the torture of adoring a ruthless king, knowing you are just a fading side character in his massive shadow. She fled to see if she still had her own mind, and now, locking on his predatory intrigues, she is choosing to stay. The life lesson here is beautifully brutal. Love means absolutely nothing unless you can easily walk out the open door. But you look at the burning room and make the choice to stay anyway.
The absolute dead silence in that kitchen so heavy you could literally cut it with very slowly. His massive tattooed hand slides across the scratched wood and just covers hers.
It isn't a trap. It isn't the toxic grip of a crime lord claiming his stolen property.
It is shockingly...
Julia,
he whispers, without a single ounce of his usual Mafia threat.
I know we can't go back, she warns him, drawing his massive line in the sand. Neither am I, he shoots back. I want something new. She flips her hand to press her palm against his scars, demanding the one thing he never gives up, absolute truth. We all need this simple life lesson. You can never rebuild a totally shattered life if you insist on using the exact same broken bricks that ruined it the first time. The camera catches the exact
split second she completely nukes his entire empire of fear. She starts dropping the new rules for their relationship. No more
making choices for her. No more acting like a literal prison warden and trying to brand it as romance. She tells him he has to sit quietly in a room with her without trying to psychologically hack her brain. That will be the hardest one, he admits, his thumb rubbing her knuckles like a fading ghost of the psychoboss he used to be. Then the unbreakable kingpin totally shatters. Yes to all of it, he says, sounding fully defeated. Not a negotiation, an agreement. Guys, the life lesson is so clear. When someone with absolute power finally drops their weapons, that is the only real proof of change. Everything else is just a super patient trap. Let us pause and rewind the tape for a second. You and I flashback to the freezing cold of early January. She had been free for a whole year, running on pure adrenaline. But the stress wrecks her, and she goes into labor 2 whole weeks early. In a total panic, she dials the monster. He shows up in exactly 11 minutes. The math on that drive is literally impossible. He was out there in the freezing rain, circling the block like a total shark, calling his sick protection. It is equally terrifying and completely heartbreaking, but listen. We all have to learn this simple life lesson eventually. Just because someone is standing right outside your front door does not mean you are actually safe. Sometimes, the fiercely loyal guard dog is really just the hungry wolf waiting to strike. The second she yanks that apartment door open, the camera shows this ruthless killer absolutely losing his grip on reality. His heavy wool coat is wide open, sleeves shoved up to show off every hardcore gang vow inked on his arms. He tries to look tough, but his dark eyes are bugging out with sheer panic. He doesn't bark a single boss order. He just offers his steady arm, instantly morphing from a guy who forces her hand to a guy desperately begging to be chosen. The rest of that hospital trip is just a chaotic blur of screaming and pain, caught between her crying best friend and the mob boss crushing her hand. Real talk, the life lesson here is wild. Sometimes in life, you only survive your absolute darkest, most violent nightmares by desperately grabbing onto the hand of the devil himself. Normally, under those harsh hospital lights, a toxic control freak completely loses his mind. He would usually be threatening the doctors just to feel like the top dog again. But this absolute kingpin
breaks all the rules of his villain nature.
He doesn't pull any weapons. He doesn't yell at a single nurse. He's totally frozen, planted exactly where she told him to stay. When the crazy pain of labor breaks down her final walls, he doesn't try to play the alpha male. He just leans in close, whispering that she is the bravest person he has ever seen. Then, right as the sun comes up, their son takes his first breath. The life lesson here is profound, real. Lasting change never kicks the door down. It sneaks up in the shocking choice to just shut your mouth and finally listen. The camera pushes way in for the massive emotional climax. The newborn lets out this crazy, loud, furious cry that cuts right through the sterile room. And as the absolute god of the underworld finally reaches out to hold his son, his terrifying boss aura literally vanishes into thin air. He pulls this tiny, screaming baby right against his chest, right over all that brutal black ink that represents his bloody Mafia legacy. His hardcore armor just drops. His face is completely raw, dripping with tears he won't even wipe away. He whispers to the kid that he is going to do better, dropping a desperate promise to the universe. Here is a beautiful life lesson for us all. The raw instinct to protect our own blood can literally rewire our broken brains, giving us one final shot at real redemption. She is side-eyeing him from the bed with the paranoid stare of a veteran surviving a massive war. She can read the violent history tattooed all over him, but even she spots the massive glitch in his armor. 2 days later, they step out into the freezing air, but get this, the mob boss doesn't drive them to his guarded compound. He drives them to her tiny apartment. A warlord willingly abandoning his fortress? That is the ultimate white flag. He makes her coffee, then stands quietly against the wall, staring at a tiny life he isn't quite allowed to touch yet. It is a total cinematic gut punch. You and I have to look at this together. The life lesson here is so real. The only way to truly love a broken survivor is to sit quietly out of their heavy stone walls and wait for an invitation. Let's break the crazy sequence down, because my mind is blown. The absolute Don, a guy who solves problems with a bat, actually offers to walk away. It's a massive tactical retreat. But bro, the second she asks him to stay for dinner, his tough-going Mafia mask completely shatters. He says yes so fast it's almost sad. They eat in this super awkward, heavy silence. And then comes the biggest plot twist ever. She just falls asleep. Her brain literally stops seeing him as a threat. He drapes a blanket over her, dips into the night, leaving a handwritten note to fix their chaotic past. The lesson here is real. True intimacy isn't some instant magic trick. You build it slowly, brick by agonizing brick, especially when your first instinct is to run away. The next morning hits, and that note is screaming his promise to wait. Over the next few weeks, this absolute unit of an enforcer shows crazy restraint. He flat out refuses to step inside place without an explicit invite. You can see Julia sweating it, her eyes darting around. She's just waiting for the mobster inside him to snap and wreck the room. But the crazy part? The violent freakout never happens. Instead, She gets a front row seat to an apex predator ripping out his own fangs. All the toxic lies just vanish. We get this tight shot of his scarred hands, holding their baby like it is made of glass, and it makes her cry. It hits you with a massive truth bomb. You can't bully someone into trusting you. Real loyalty only happens when you show up every single day with completely empty hands. Look at how this dude moves now. He's done barking orders and just quietly handles what she needs. 6 weeks of this weird waiting game go by, and then Julia pulls a massive wild card. She calls up Ferrante, that sweaty lawyer, and tells him to cancel the divorce. The lawyer literally freezes. He finally gets this insane plot twist. She's walking back into the fire on purpose. The power dynamic is totally flipped. She isn't the hostage anymore. She's holding the launch codes. Ferrante just sighs and feeds the papers into a shredder, looking so over this Mafia drama. Still, the lesson here hits hard. Forgiveness doesn't magically erase a violent past. It's just that crazy, terrifying moment where you need to drop your heavy armor and see what happens next. She picks a quiet Sunday to hand him the shredded divorce papers. The director kills the music completely. It's dead quiet, except for the baby breathing. When Matteo sees the trash, Julia hits him with a cold warning. Don't think you've won. Then the craziest thing happens. The Mafia boss actually agrees. He admits he's still on thin ice, and that his violent street cred got him nowhere. Watching a guy with a massive ego swallow his pride is insane. She whispers for him to step closer. He stops just outside her reach, his gang ink catching the light. Here's the ultimate lesson.
True power, bulletproof gangster, directly at the absolute monster, your life.
And finally realizing your fear is entirely gone. The camera gets close as she reaches past his expensive suit and prison tattoos, pressing her hand to his chest. Her eyes lock on her, setting the final boundary. The past is still a bloody mess. But she's rolling the dice on this broken man anyway. Matteo traps her hand over his heart, and you can almost feel his chest hammering. He swears he'll spend forever, proving he changed. The kiss that drops next is legendary. It isn't that toxic, aggressive stuff from Act 1. It's incredibly slow, packed with the terrifying weight of real trust. People get forgiveness backwards. Healing doesn't mean pretending the monster never existed. It just means the villain has finally figured out how to belie like the rest of us. You and I need to unpack this, but because the setup is wild, the director draws a massive visible line. Julia is the absolute boss now. Her apartment is a fortress, and this ruthless Mafia Don is just a visitor. The crazy part is he takes the downgrade without a single complaint. Out of nowhere, the baby monitor goes off, but Matteo doesn't rush into the room. He completely freezes. This huge, dangerous guy stands there, waiting for Julia to give him a tiny nod of approval. Only then does the hitman pick up his kid, acting like he's holding dynamite. The guy who used to burn down cities is getting bossed around by a crying infant. It's hilarious, but totally real. The strongest, unbreakable chains we ever wear in life are exactly the ones we beg people to put on us. The camera catches Julia against a huge window, looking over the freezing streets of Milan. Everyone down there has zero clue about the absolute mental chess match that just wrapped up. Stick with me on this because it's pure genius. She isn't trying to tape a toxic, broken marriage back together. She's pouring fresh concrete for a completely new empire. Somehow, this woman literally hacked the brain of a top-tier mob boss and turned off his killer instincts. She's staring down the future with the ice-cold energy of a total survivor. As the scene fades, it drops a massive reality check. You can't save a doomed house by buying slashing cheap paint over rotten wood. You only survive by bulldozing the whole thing to the dirt and building brand new walls that can actually take a punch. Let this final shot completely sink in, guys. It's the ultimate flex. Look at the lighting in that nursery. We have a literal Mafia Don, a dude who spent 20 years making grown men cry, completely frozen, just holding a sleeping baby. Across the room stands Julia. With 0 weapons, she totally rewired this dangerous mobster's brain. His hard-car street looks morphed just into a beautiful, inescapable trap. The screen cuts to black, leaving us with one brutal truth. Real power is never about how many enemies you can crush. It's about the one person you finally surrender your whole heart to. Thanks for riding out this wild breakdown with me today. If this ending got you hyped, smash subscribe and drop your theories in the comments. I'll catch you guys in the next video.